First of all, welcome to everybody here in the room. We have a select company, and it's wonderful to see you here. We've had an opportunity to talk over a drink and wonderful food, and we're ready for divine consumption. I'm not the person who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. The person who's doing that is our Director of Publications, Randy Danforth. My name is Willeke Wendrich. I'm the Director of the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology, and I work closely together with Randy, who really has brought our publication series to a completely new level. We publish mainly books that have a lot of data, archaeological data, as well as a lot of theoretical thought about the past, about human behavior, about all of us now and in the past. Randy has a background in archaeology and a background in publication. We met first in Cairo when she was working for the American University of Cairo Press, and we worked together there. And I was delighted that she decided to join us at UCLA to head the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology Press. Randy will introduce tonight's speaker, but I really want to recognize the great work that she has done for the press. And the press is really at the core of what we're doing as a research unit at UCLA. Please welcome Randy.
Thank you very much, Willeke. That was making my ears burn. And after a few minutes of divine consumption on the terrace out there, crab cakes, etc., I don't want to make the people at home jealous, but we had a lovely reception. And I'm very happy to introduce the second in our series of Authors Spotlight featured speakers at the UCLA Coatsen Institute of Archaeology. Stephen Dueppen received his BA from UC San Diego and MA and PhD from the University of Michigan in the cohort of our own Lee Min. And thank you, Min, for recommending the Coatsen Press to Stephen for his book. We really appreciate the networking. In fact, Stephen told me yesterday that it was when he saw Willeke's book, the Fayum book, and saw the quality and fantastic presentation that he was inspired to submit his proposal to us, and we're very happy that he did. His research centers on the past 3 millennia in West Africa, exploring diverse topics ranging from the origins of iron-using farming societies, ritual practices, the development of inequalities, egalitarian revolutions, and the effects of the Black Death pandemic. Very timely. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Dueppen, our latest published author.
Thank you very much, Randy, and thank you everyone for inviting me here to present on this book project. Okay, so just to kind of preface a little bit here, this is an image, kind of a representation of what we're thinking about in terms of a divine landscape in the Mounded region of Western Burkina Faso. And so I worked with an artist, Neo Lohoko, on creating this image to think about different divisions in the landscape and how they tie to different divine associations in terms of the ethnohistory of this part of West Africa. And so some of the things you can see there is you can see that there's houses on anthropogenic mounds or tells on the right side of the image. And then you can see some subterranean contexts, which include an iron furnace. Because one of the interesting things about ethnohistoric ironworking in this particular region is semi-subterranean furnaces. And I'm going to get to that in terms of divine associations because it connects to divinities in the deeper parts of the earth. We're going to connect that also to termite mounds and some of these other mines and other quarries and things like that are inside the earth because they have different divine associations. And then grasslands and forests also have different divine associations as well. And then when you get to the Mounded River there, you can see shallow water versus deep water, which also connects to seasonality and different divine associations in terms of religious practice. And these are some of the things that we're actually going to see materialized in the archaeological record at Kirikongo, both in the site that I've been excavating, both in the animal remains as well as in some of the material culture. And so at its core, this book is part of a long-term project that I've been working on for the past 20 years to try to understand what are the tell sites of Western Burkina Faso. So tell sites are widely distributed throughout West Africa in different regions. And they can be arranged in different ways spatially. Some of them are very large, one mound, which can be 30 or 40 hectares in size, for example, in the Niger Delta region. In Western Burkina Faso, the tell sites tend to be clusters of smaller mounds, 1 to 2 hectares in size and 2 to 4 meters in height. And so part of this project is based in these extensive excavations that I've done over the years of these tells, and trying to figure out literally what they are and how they formed over time. So those are some of the kind of fundamental questions of the research project. And I'm going to tie them to kind of ideas of religious history and political histories in this region as well. So just for some context, religion plays a very big role in interpretation in West African archaeology. And so I'm drawing on a big record of a kind of religious focus and interpretation in archaeology, going way back to Nkwanda's research in 1987, for example. And so one of the fundamental arguments, one of the things I found in my excavations is that we have non-random animal bones, we have non-random material culture that are found inside of these tells with remnants of architecture. And I'm going to go through some of the patterning in today's talk because that's a part of the main theoretical and methodological focus of the book. And so my main arguments are around the idea of sacrifice, which has played a big role in the ethnohistoric record in West Africa. And this includes sacrifice of domestic animals and also of material culture. So a lot of these ritualized deposits are related to the making of ancestors at death. And so it's not just the domestic animals that are being sacrificed as part of this ritual practice, it's also the material culture within the archaeological sites as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of attachment and detachment and simultaneous attachment and detachment that occurs with the creation of ancestors in this particular zone that we can see materialized in the archaeological record. This is differentiated from some other things that are found in these ritual accumulations in the sites, including parts of wild animals, and I'm going to tie them to some of those ecological divisions that connect to the divine landscape, because different families have different ecological associations in these ritual depositions over time. Natural substances are not sacrificed because they don't belong to people, and I'll talk a little bit about that as kind of a religious idea as well. And another thing which is not sacrificed is found objects. So actually older stone tools and things like that from earlier periods of time are included in these ritual accumulations within some of these tell sites. Those are not sacrificed because they were also not made by living people. And so thinking about these ideas of divinity. And so at its core, one of the things I'm trying to do in terms of interpretation of tell sites is thinking about sacrifice as a major component of site formation. And it's part of this broader, the relationships between people and different divinities in the landscape, and then also with the ancestors, who are one of those divine entities with which they're establishing relationships. So it's about making these attachments, and I'm going to use the word attachment a lot in this presentation. So just to give you a little bit of an idea on the archaeology, like in many parts of West Africa, archaeology is pretty recent in origin. It's mostly a post-colonial development. But the Mounded region is one of the regions where we know the best in terms of the amount of research, the greatest amount on tell sites, and that's because there's been multiple archaeological projects over the last 25 to 30 years. So I wanted to highlight some of the previous research, and then I'll get into the research at Kirikongo that we've been talking about in terms of tell formation. So some of the earliest research in this area of West Africa was by Lucina Cote, one of my mentors, who's been doing ongoing survey, recording, and site preservation. He also sponsored the construction of that local museum that's in the village of Darula. This was followed then by the Mounded Archaeological Project by Augustin Hall and Lucina Cote between 1997 and 2000. I was a student on that project as an undergraduate. And then starting in 2004, I began the Kirikongo Archaeological and Kirikongo Regional projects around Kirikongo, with Daphne Gallagher. And then we ran that project from 2004 to 2011 in the field, and lab analyses are continuing from these projects because there's quite a bit of material that was excavated. Okay, so where in West Africa are we? We're basically in the middle of West Africa. You can see right there's the Mounded River that's kind of flowing north, and then it hits this bend, and then it turns its direction of flow towards the south, and it becomes the Black Volta River in Ghana, and then flows into the Lake Volta. And so the Mounded Bend is basically this region. I have an image. The next image kind of shows you kind of a close-up of the river as it makes this bend in terms of the archaeological sites in this region as well. But basically, it's one of the major rivers within West Africa. But one of the interesting things about this riverine system is that it doesn't have a lot of floodplains associated with it. So it has some very different kind of agricultural systems that are associated with the archaeological sites. And so a series of sites within the Mounded Bend, these are clusters of tells. So they're, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, most of the tells are between 1 and 2 hectares in size, and they're arranged in clusters. And that's one of the things I'll be talking a little bit as we go through today's lecture here, which is that each of the households has their own tell. And these are long-lived tells, in some cases at Kirikongo, for example, that are occupied continuously for 1,500 years and reach to about 4 meters of depth of occupation. So these are some of the main sites that have been excavated to date: Dueppen, Karabe Seratomo, Torres Seratomo, and then Kirikongo there in the south. Okay, so the site of Kirikongo is a pretty large site. I mean, that's one of the first things to kind of think about. And we're going to talk about different eras because it was occupied for a very long period of time. So it's 13 mounds, 2 to 4 meters high. There's 4 different ironworking areas that date to different periods of time. There's 3 quarries, pretty extensive. Some of them cover a huge amount of space. And this whole distributed cultural site is spread over 37.5 hectares, so a pretty big area. It was occupied from around 100 to 1650 AD, and working on dating some of the earliest phases, so it might even be a couple hundred years earlier than that. But the thing that was always, of interest to me from the very beginning of excavation is just how much well-preserved architectural remains there are in the site. And I'm going to show you some of the stratigraphies, and you're going to see basically that there's house, 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 house. And there's also an incredible amount of investment in architecture. So they developed really complicated pavement techniques. And so the pavements are really, really, really thick and strong. And there's evidence for multi-story architecture as well that goes pretty deep in the past at Kirikongo. Associated with these architectural remnants, and this has been, just kind of more broadly, one of the big questions about tells worldwide has always been, why are there so many architectural remnants within tells? Because that's an active cultural choice, right? So the question of what are the kind of decisions that are going into leaving a remnant of an architectural complex and then building atop it. And oftentimes it's not just leveling, it can be a bunch of different cultural choices. And at Kirikongo, these architectural remnants are not just associated with remains of collapsed architecture or anything like that. In fact, there's very little collapsed architecture. So it speaks to this kind of agentive or purposeful kind of construction processes. There's also a lot of ritualized pits and concavities where there's rich accumulations of materials. They do not resemble in any regard midden deposits, which has also been part of my research, which is that they're non-random associations. And so I'm going to get into some of the different material classes as we move through this presentation. But they include dense ash deposits, animal bones, not very non-random animal bones, a lot of fragmented material culture, some complete objects, which is kind of connecting to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Some of those are, the complete objects are objects which are not made locally or imported or actually are old or ancient stone tools that were found within the area. And these are associated with these architectural remnants over time. And these have been kind of the interpretive focus for my archaeological research, which is trying to figure out what are the relationships or the contextual dynamics within some of these ritualized accumulations, tying them then to the architecture. And then the other thing is that we know a lot about the tells at Kirikongo also because there's some road cuts through 3 of the mounds at the site, which I'll get into a little bit later as well. But you can see there's the 13 mounds. We've done excavations all over the site. We've done surface collections. We did shovel tests. And you'll see that 3 of the mounds were cut by the road. And so we do know where the areas where the midden was. And so we can also kind of think about comparing the site formations on the edges of the mounds versus what you're actually finding in the excavations on the interior, which I believe to be largely ritual deposits. And then a little bit of background before I get into kind of unpacking the ritual deposits is that Kirikongo has it's occupied during a very dynamic period. And some of the things that I've written about in the past, my first book was on an egalitarian revolution, because basically what we can see over time is the site growing, and you can kind of see this on the sequence up there. The top 3 boxes are basically the first millennium AD, and then the bottom 2 there are parts of the early first half of the second millennium AD. And you can see that the community grew from one tell into this kind of cluster over time. This is correlated with increasing centralization. So the founding house of the community co-opted iron production, and so there's kind of centralized iron production. We see that also reflected in wealth as well. So they co-opted cattle as well at a particular period of time. You can see the spatial organization of the site. Everything starts to center on Mound 4 right there, which is the earliest of the houses at Kirikongo. And there's also a mortuary, there's a cemetery area that's associated with this elite household. And then as the community grew, there was actually a decentralization of the political system that occurred within the community. And so the bottom 2 right there, the one on the left is late Red 2 to Red 3, is a period of revolution that I talked about previously, where cattle keeping was literally abolished. Ironworking and potting moved to Mound 11 on the exterior. And this connects to some ethno-historic social divisions and hereditary occupation groups for different production activities. Red 4 there, as was mentioned in the introduction, that's the plague era. So one of the things that we were working on right before the current pandemic was the Black Death pandemic in this particular region, which scholars had assumed had not, there's this long history of people assuming that the Black Death pandemic didn't hit sub-Saharan Africa. And we found very, very robust evidence that it did. And Kirikongo is one of the kind of sites where we have a pretty extensive evidence. But in the Mohun Bend, multiple sites were abandoned, and then the sites that made it through the 1300s by the end were much more reduced in terms of occupation area. So you can see the difference between the bottom 2 right there. That's the occupied area before the pandemic and then after the pandemic. And there's a lot of cultural changes that would occur during that period of time. Okay, so this is kind of it's a very large site. I just wanted to give an image of thinking about these different tells. So there's one of the excavation units on Mound 1, and you can see 3 of the mounds in the background there. There's 13, so you can see this is actually a pretty substantial site. And then the bottom image right there is one of the road cuts that goes through these tells, and you can see all the preserved floors and architectural remnants in there. Those are in the core, and so then we do know where the middens are in terms of trash and things like that are on the edges. What we're looking at is the core where there's a lot of preserved architecture. And so this is what's actually inside of the tells right there. So you can see that, the big questions that happened in terms of excavations at Kirikongo was thinking about why are there such well-preserved architectural remnants that are in this particular sequence over time, and they're very well stratified one from the other. And then associated with these architectural remnants then, there's very well-preserved material culture in some of these little pits or concavities that are associated with some of these architectural units. And so here's some images of some of the well-preserved pottery. That iron spear right there is from 300 AD. These are the one in the middle right there is, this will connect to the themes later in terms of ancestors. This is one of these half of a tripod double cup. So there's a cup on top and a cup on bottom. I'm going to talk a little bit later because one of the things I argued in the book was that the double cup is about rituals related to ancestors, where one of the cups facing the ground where the ancestors are, and the other cup is for the sacrifice at the top that then connects to those ideas of divinity. There's preserved cowrie shells, there's cattle bones, lots of botanic remains. And I'm going to talk first about the faunal remains that are in these depositions to kind of think about the patterns that we found that connect to some of these divine associations. So the faunal assemblage, and for the zooarchaeologists out there, I think the faunal assemblage of Kirikongo will be quite interesting. First off, because one of the things that was very striking to me when I started to do the animal bone analyses was just the incredible rate of identification. So over half of the bones are identifiable. There's not a lot of debris. So that's one fundamental component of that. And they're found in these mixed accumulations with this material culture and things of that nature. There's at least 59 taxa represented, but they're not, we'll talk a little bit about the fact that there's kind of a baseline diversity that occurs in every deposit. And then wild animals are found in ecological association with one another inside ritual deposits. So like animals of the deep earth will be found in a particular context versus those of the forest and things of that nature. And those repeat within a family over time, such that there's that kind of repetition. Seasonality also will repeat over time as well. So in doing the faunal analyses, I was looking at preservation. First off, that they're very well preserved because they're sealed immediately. So these are not open. There's not a lot of dog gnawing or things like that. Another thing I looked at is body part distribution to see how this would relate to sacrificial practice. And one of the things we see that all of the different stages of the process are there, but that many parts of the body are distributed away, but not all. And there's patterning in the parts that are not distributed away. There's a lot of patterning in the processing methods more broadly. And then the assemblage diversity, I have a slide up in a moment, that there's a baseline diversity of animals that, in a sense, ritually need to be there. And then there's animals beyond that tell you a little bit about divine associations more specifically. And we can see those ecological associations over time. There are fundamental differences in the way that domestic animals are used from wild animals. And they have these ecological and seasonal animal associations. And the different houses have different, or have access to different parts of nature. And so then the argument in the book is essentially that these connections to different parts of nature then potentially are parts of different parts of the divine landscape to which those houses have alliances or attachments over time. And the fact that they're being put into deposits that are part of ancestors means that there's continuity as well, multi-generationally, in access to particular places in the landscape or divinities. And the other thing is that those change with the politics in the community more broadly. So one of the things I'll mention a little bit later is that I talked about the co-option of ironworking and the origins of inequalities within the community. One of the things we see during the period of co-option of ironworking by the founding house of the community is the beginnings of finding clusters of subterranean animals associated with ironworking contexts within the community. And so this is a chart. This is a division into different excavation units that we've done throughout the community. And you can see that basically, the first set right there that are all kind of in the same area, that's one household. And they have complete, fairly repeated diversity within all of their contexts over time, like non-random associations. The community's founding house, which is in the middle right there, has a much greater diversity. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that diversity actually means in terms of the particular animals, but some of it has to do with subterranean contexts and things of that nature. The cemetery that is associated with that founding house, which is the next group right here, has basically the same kind of diversity situation as the founding house itself. And then the last one is for an ironworking mound. And so we'll talk a little bit about why they have a baseline diversity, but it's a little bit different in content. And so this is a slide I put in the book, basically, which was looking at the number of contexts within which particular animals appeared. And so one of the things you can see right here, and I'll just kind of point out different areas here, is that at the top right there, you can see there's fish, sheep and goats, chickens, and bivalves. Those are found in almost every single deposit. Now, of course, these are non-random associations because one of the kind of fascinating things about Kirikongo is that there's not often that much of anything in particular. Almost every single context has at least one piece of shell. They oftentimes won't have two, they may not have three, but it seems to be fundamental that they have this kind of baseline diversity in terms of animal remains within the site. And then the ones in the middle there are feasted upon wild animals from particular political events. And then the ones down at the bottom right there are ones that are tied to particular ecological associations and ritual practices in the landscape in terms of a divine landscape. And so I'm going to get into some of the details as we move a little bit further in terms of how that connects to political history. But then what's happening to material culture? Well, material culture is also being sacrificed. And I believe that the architectural remnants within the sites themselves are sacrificed houses as part of a process of detachment and then reattachment in the new role as an ancestor. And I think that's what a lot of the fragmented material culture also is within the sites. These are the associations of people in life that are being broken as part of a process of detachment, ritual detachment, and then being reattached by including small fragments of them in these ritualized depositions within fragments of sacrificed houses before you can construct again within the archaeological sites. So the material culture is also very well preserved because it's not out there for very long. It is part of these ritual processes, it's interred, and then it's usually floored over or paved over. So it's almost all systematically broken, but there's never all of a pot. So it's not like a midden deposit. A lot of other objects, metal objects, are sometimes broken. You can see the broken bracelet down at the bottom right there, or they're bent, different types of ways of detachment. You can see the beads right there in the kind of the center of the image right there. A lot of those beads are, you can see they're literally broken in half, so cleanly, but the other part of the bead is never in the ritual deposit. You see what I mean? So there's this kind of this idea of kind of detachment with reattachment that's going on in terms of the archaeological sites. But a couple of those are not broken. So that's a glass bead, the top left one, the kind of porous one, that's a glass bead that is not broken because it's not made locally. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means because it's not tied to these ideas of connections between people and material culture in terms of souls. And then if we look at the stone tools right there, you can see that they've had the edges taken off of them, but they're in very, very good condition more broadly, all of them. They're not discarded at the point of being worn out. So these are objects that basically are being purposefully fragmented as part of kind of funerary rituals. And then this one right here, that is actually a basalt axe. And we believe that that's a found object that's from an earlier period of time, probably a symbolic object. It is not broken because it is not connected to people in that particular way. And so ceramic assemblages, if you actually, so we've been doing analyses of ceramic assemblages, and first off, there's a lot of tripod vessels in these accumulations, which are these widely considered to be ancestor veneration vessels where there's the double cup, one facing the sacrificer and then one facing the ground. Another thing is that there's a lot of small, very well decorated ritual vessels in these depositions as well that are in good repair. But there's never all of it. And in fact, there's usually just one really nice piece of all these different vessels as well. And I recently published, with Daphne Gallagher, we published an article on the fact that there's a lot of small vessels that also might be related to libations in terms of beer, in terms of ritual practices as well. And then things that are older, potentially Neolithic tools that have been picked up and brought to the archaeological site, incorporated into these shrines, tend to be not broken, nor are things that are imported. And so, for example, the spindle rolls up there basically might have been being imported into the region. And these dolerite spheres right here are very common in Neolithic sites, and they may be things that were brought to the site. And so they're connections to particular parts of the landscape that these people are essentially materializing in terms of the funerary deposits. And it's also the architecture that's being sacrificed in terms of thinking about the archaeological record of these tell sites. So this is one of the tell sections. So you probably noticed earlier that the phases are named yellow and red, and that's because of the pavement techniques that were made at the different time periods as well. So this is a cross-section of, in Mound 1 of the red phase. And so first off, you can see the red pavements right there. Those are laterite pavements that are mixed with clay, and they make really strong pavements. And then you can see a series of houses with floors, houses with floors. And in one case, you can see a ritual accumulation. So all those objects right there are kind of in one of these ritual accumulations that is associated with the architecture. And so the architecture within these particular sites are systematic remnants. They're all kind of treated the same way at the point in which they cease to be used. And there's two different kinds of houses that we figured out in the excavations. One of which is houses that are about 2.5 to 3 meters in diameter that are domestic structures that are then converted to mortuary houses. And then usually directly atop those, a small partial symbolic ancestor house is constructed right atop it. So in fact, there may be 2 strata for every individual within the community, where you have their house where someone was living in or doing activities in, and essentially then an ancestor house, a dedicated one, after the remnants and ritual deposition is interred. Then there's a small house, a ritual house that's built atop that. And then there's about 80 or 100 years before you can put a new stratum on top. And the argument in the book is that that takes about the time for the memories of the person to fade within the community, and then they enter into a status of more generalized ancestor within the mounds, which are, the mounds are kind of building up over time. These are not, when these are ritually detached from people, they're not filled with trash or architectural collapse. And another line of evidence that that's the case is that we can see a couple cases where there's true abandonment, and then we see where the terrace roofs fell in on the interiors of the structures, and they're kind of a different kind of pattern that goes on with them. And there's another exception to the pattern, which is a burned ritual complex, which is the lower slide right there. That's one of those 2-story architectural units within the site, where basically we can see a structure that was there for 350 to 400 years, which was a central ritual, a temple essentially in the center of the town, that was used for 350 to 400 years and then burned down. And we can see a different formation process going on there than what we're talking about in terms of ritual practices. However, the temple itself had a room of sacrifice in it where we see a lot of the same things that we see in the ritualized accumulations for ancestor rituals. Okay, so then one of the other main theses within the book is kind of addressing this idea of sacrifice and why some things are sacrificable, to account for the variability that we're finding in the archaeological site. So why are domestic animals, material culture, and architectural sacrificable, and then unaltered substances and trade items not, right? And so essentially, through looking at the extensive ethnohistoric record throughout this part, West Africa, one of the arguments within the book is that they're not spiritually connected to the divinities in the landscape. Things that are made within the community, of course, are things that through a process of transubstantiation are connected to people in a particular way. And so therein, they're part of this kind of cultural relationship. Domestic animals also don't have a divine origin beyond humans. And if you go in the chapter 1 of the book, I talk a lot about stories about the origins of domestic animals as opposed to wild animals. And kind of a recurring theme in terms of stories about the origins of domestic animals is that they have a divine origin, but it's not connected to the divinities that are placed in different places in the landscape. And so they're solely associated with people and then can be detached from people. Wild animals, on the other hand, are associated with divinities in the landscape in different kind of ecological associations, and so are not ownable or controllable by people. And so those are part of interactions with a broader divine landscape. And that is also true of things that are not made by people locally, because they're not kind of connected through the soul in the material production process with people. So that's why old stone tools, things that are brought into the landscape, are coming from particular places. They are associated with divinities in the landscape, and they weren't made by people within the community. They haven't gone through that process of transubstantiation. And that's why the glass bead also, which was imported in, is not broken. And so that's part of the argument of the book, is that there's the ritualized depositions. There are some things that are sacrificable, and then there are other things that have to be interred complete because they are not ownable by people, so consequently they can't be sacrificed as part of this process. And then comparing the things in these ritualized depositions connected to these architectural units throughout the community, we found some repeated associations then between the different families that we can connect to some of those political processes. And also it tells you a little bit about what's going on also during the pandemic, the Black Death pandemic. So one of the interesting things that we found essentially in looking through the different associations is that the founding house is always associated with the harvest season. So these ritualized accumulations, whatever mortuary practice is occurring that's creating these ancestor houses, for the founding house of the community is always occurring at the ends of the rainy season into the early dry season. Whereas other houses, like the second house that was founded within the community, all of its remains where we can get seasonality data are from deeper in the dry season. And we can see this from, in some regards, whether they can get flood recession, fishing, and other types of animals, as opposed to deep water fishing and other types of things like that. Another thing which we see is this association between subterranean contexts in the animals that are found in the deposits, and also some materials too. So there's a lot of, in some of the detached mortuary houses potentially for blacksmiths or those associated with blacksmiths, there's iron ore. There's actually depositions of iron ore mixed with some of these subterranean animals in terms of those deposits. After a revolution which occurred, which actually took ironworking away from the founding house as part of this kind of egalitarian process that I've published on previously, later on the founding house formed an association with the forest, which I think is connected to a ritual system, ethnohistorically, the origins of an ethnohistoric religious system called the Jo within western Burkina Faso and eastern Mali, that is connected to the forest and different divine associations of the forest. And it's really quite stunning, the repetition in the different households in terms of these different divine associations. So for example, the second oldest house within the community, not only are the ritual depositions from deeper in the dry season, they're also, in many cases, when we get to the period of forest associations, for example, they're limited to grassland environments. So they'll have only grazing animals within the zoo archaeological assemblage. The Black Death pandemic may have kind of fundamentally altered some of these ritual practices within the community at a particular period of time, because we believe that many of the households were abandoned and people may have clustered together at the founding house and then also in the blacksmith and potting specialist area. And so the forest associations then become available to everyone out of this pandemic period because they can no longer be centralized by the founding house. And so I'm going to give you a couple slides thinking about some of these animal associations. So we see, for example, when we're looking at grassland associations in some of the ritual deposits, we basically see clusters of animals like these, like the hartebeest or the cob or the reedbuck or the oribi, that are found in association with one another. But they'll often be without other wild animals, and these are very specific to a particular ecological context, which is quite fascinating because the Mahun Bend region of Burkina Faso is a mixed environment. So these are very kind of specific choices that you wouldn't necessarily make, in a sense, out in the landscape. One of the most fascinating were the subterranean associations. So these are the animals of the earth. So there's a couple different things going on here. Many of these animals live in the earth. Some of them live in old termite dens. And when you go into the ethnohistoric, looking at religious practices ethnohistorically, there's a lot of stories about the deep earth contexts. And I think they're connecting to some of these other things that are connected to ironworking in terms of divine associations. So there's a lot of mongooses that live in termite mounds. There's lizards that live in dens underground. And then kind of interesting thing is that termites themselves, because they live in the deep earth in the ethnohistoric record, are very divine entities. And so there's a lot of animals that are also associated, those that eat termites are also found in these ritualized associations. So thinking about those connections between those different contexts. These are never found. So for example, these kinds of practices are very stunning in terms of the zooarchaeological record of Kirikongo. The second house founded, which never became blacksmithing was co-opted at a particular early period of time, so they were only briefly doing iron production at the mound. They never have any of these animals in their ritualized depositions, even though there's many of them repeated over time. In fact, at Mound 1, there's literally not a reptile bone in the entire mound through the excavations. So thinking about these kinds of connections to particular places in the landscape that I think are connecting kind of religious practices as well. And then only at particular periods of time do we find forest associations entering into the zooarchaeological record. These animals would have been available. And so that's when we think about the kind of purposeful kind of agentive control that's occurring in terms of these decisions. That's one of the kind of fascinating parts of it. Animals like the roan antelope that do a little bit more browsing, some of the forest dikers. There's thinking about bush buck right there. These are some of these forest associations. That's then you can see that in the illustration right there. Those are the kinds of contexts. And then in addition to fusion points, so think about when animals, different bones on the body of an animal fuse at different months of the year. Another line of evidence for seasonality is think about the water resources and when they're actually going to the river. So in the Mounded Bend, this is a little bit easier to see because the Mounded Bend's not in a floodplain environment. And so there's a very small floodplain. And so there's two really different seasonal faces to the Mounded. There's a period where there's a lot of shallow water, and then there's basically a deep channel. And there's different resources that are available in those different seasons. So, for example, there's some of the shallow water resources that are easier to get during the floods or flood recession, like turtles or tilapia or Clarius catfish. And then there's the deeper water fish, like the Nile perch or the Synodontis catfish. These are often then found with bivalves that also are only harvestable in particular seasons. So, for example, the Nile oyster basically is only, you can only collect it when the river descends. And that's the kind of typical season for collecting those resources. Versus Chambardia bivalves are found in kind of shallow water contexts, and then they dig into the mud in other seasons of the year. And then the other thing that we see in the ritualized accumulations is a lot of changes after the pandemic more broadly. So there's changes in the ways or the reasons that people are hunting and making connections to other regions as well. And this is something I'm going to follow up on in future research. So there is some hunting. They're treated ritually in similar ways to previous periods of time. But one of the things that we see after the pandemic is people becoming more and more invested ritually in establishing connections to regions beyond the Mounded Bend region. And so one of the things that we see in ritualized depositions after the Black Death pandemic is a lot of animals being hunted for products, but then being also ritually interred within these as well. So it's thinking about other associations that are not just local associations as well. So the top image right there is a warthog where the basically tusk has been removed, and that was part of ivory trades in the ancient world. And the bottom kind of bone right there is a jackal mandible where the teeth have been removed, and then it's put in this kind of ritualized deposition. But this is kind of the first period where we get a lot of animals that are associated with commercial systems, and there's a big kind of break in that as well. And I think this is part of recentering or kind of people kind of thinking about other types of association in the post-pandemic world. And there's a lot of cultural changes that occur during that particular period of time. And I'm going to be doing some work on that in the future because I think this has to do with some religious changes in the community more broadly. And so then thinking about the implications of kind of the idea of what literally is a tell, which is the book is basically the main argument is that the mounds are essentially sequential layered ancestor shrines over time. And then the edges of the mounds are, you can see middens and things of that nature that are agentive, that are purposefully created, that are showing these connections to a divine world for the ancestors that are carrying them into death with them. But those attachments then provide a social anchor for the house going forward. And you can see the kind of attachments that are interred within the sites as well. And so they kind of materialize a lot of different components of social identities and also these political identities over time as basically these periods of inequity, periods of egalitarian revolution, periods of pandemic. And we can see patterning in the way that different families are connected to different places in the landscape that connect with a lot of ethno-historic practices in terms of divine landscapes. And we can kind of see those repeated pretty systematically over time. And then we can see a kind of fundamental shift, which also occurs during the Black Death pandemic, which we've begun to publish different things on the Black Death era, but this is going to be kind of a focus of a lot of future research as well. Thinking about some of the kind of fundamental ways that a large loss of population affected society, and that is also then going to be, in a sense, materialized in the archaeological record in a variety of different ways as well. There are also some other implications that I get into in the conclusion chapter as well, which have to do with the interpretation of a lot of other archaeological sites in West Africa more broadly. So I'll give kind of an example, thinking about going back to the second millennium BC. So one of the famous Neolithic cultures in ancient West Africa is the Kintampo culture. And one of the things that scholars have long said, and this is not something I'm saying, and scholars have long said, that there seems to be a purposeful materialization of houses after death. So they made wattle and daub architecture, and it seems like they're burning the houses at death, which then makes these durable burned pieces of daub that are found all over the Contempo world. They're often associated with pits. So like if we go to the site of Tereso or sites like that, or even Barimi, those are found associated with these pits, many of which have very well preserved material culture in different states and a lot of animal bones as well. I think there's a deeper tradition of the idea of creating a durable anchor for ancestors in terms of ritual practices within West Africa that precedes this particular period of time after metallurgical production begins. That probably goes pretty deep in the Neolithic, this concern with creating a durable way to access the ancestors that's materializing where they are in the landscape, thinking about the future as well for the community. And so that's there's a whole bunch of different arguments I have in that regard in terms of the potential potential implications of this. But there is a lot of preserved architecture and archaeological sites in West Africa, and the question is why do people leave remnants of architecture, and then what's going on in these pits that are found in archaeological sites more broadly? So I think that's pretty good. I'm going to go through the acknowledgements here. So a lot of different funding agencies have supported this research, from the NSF, National Geographic Society, the Smithsonian Institution, University of Oregon, University of Michigan, the Oregon Humanities Center, the Institute for Cognitive and Decision-Making Sciences at the University of Oregon, and the American Council of Learned Societies. In Burkina Faso, there's a lot of people I'd like to thank. A lot of individuals at the Laboratory of Archaeology at the University of Ouagadougou, the National Center for Science and Technology, the Ministry of Culture, the local museum in Darula, Lassina Cote, who began research in the Mounded region and has done some pretty significant work over the years, and is also curating the archaeological collections from the Mounded. Daphne Gallagher, Léonce Key and Fabrice Dabire, students at the University of Ouagadougou that have worked on projects with us in the Mounded. In addition, in 2011, Anusa Nombre, Balakisa Sogodogo, Nafisatu Wadrago, and Drissa Cote, they all participated in the research, as did Abdoulaye Quetta, Amadou Konaté, Mama Cote, Awa Saware, Batima Konate, Madeleine Taro, and more generally the communities of Darula, Tora, and Kirikongo, who've been so hospitable to us in our research over the years. And in the production of the book, there's a lot of artists that have worked with me on different, so those animal drawings that you were seeing in the images previously are by Ethan Schmunk, who worked in the lab and did just an incredible job. And so some of the images are on the cover of the book. And then the ritual landscape piece is by Neo Lahoko, a landscape architecture graduate student who did an incredible job kind of doing a depiction of these kinds of different levels of divinity in the landscape. And then for a lot of the maps in the book, Alethea Steingisser in the infographics lab at the Department of Geography did a lot of exceptional work as well to kind of visualize. Archaeology is so visual, and I think these kinds of illustrations help to kind of evoke the different kind of ideas of divine associations within the book. And then there's the customary sunset in the Mounded region. Well, thank you for being here.